Hi there. Thank you for taking the time to watch this session. I hope you find it interesting. My name is Virginia. I am the Information Services Librarian at the Belleville Public Library. And today I'm going to be talking about Belleville's spooky history. So without further ado, here we go. Okay, so here's an agenda. So we're going to talk a brief little bit about spiritualism, seances. I'm going to cover the Fox sisters, the Moodies, Flora, MacDonald, Denison, and her sister Mary Edwards Merrill, an individual known as B.F. Austin, Jenny O'Hare Pincock, Dr. Henry Slade, and some concluding remarks. So I'm going to cover some background information, and then I'm going to talk about some figures that are important to the spiritualist movement and in Belleville. Okay, so what is spiritualism? So this is the belief that the living can communicate with the dead through the conduit of mediums. And most historians agree that it was primarily popularized in the West with the Fox sisters in the 1840s. But it is important to note that spirit communication did exist before then, especially in non-Western nations. But how we understand spiritualism today, the movement of spiritualism really began with the Fox sisters. So what is spiritualism? It's essentially using scientific evidence to support religious beliefs. So it's using science to prove the existence of the afterlife, essentially. And so in this time period, in the 19th century, we really see a big burst of scientific discovery. So we have advances in medicine and biology and geology and chemistry and engineering and astronomy and all these things. But the biggest one, obviously, was electricity. That made such a huge impact. And with that came inventions like the telegraph, greater understanding of radio waves and magnetic fields. And this sort of invisible technology, so you're able to transmit messages over wires invisible, like you don't see the messages occur, they just appear. And that's really key because this concept of things being there but not being within our awareness really influenced ideas of spiritualism. So the idea that people's spirits are perceivable, but we need a conduit to do that, some kind of way to manifest these conversations. And that's kind of where spiritualism came in. And that's where these ideas really came from. And again, at this time, there's a huge push towards making science a profession and using the scientific method in all kinds of different fields. So again, you see things like engineering and medicine really becoming very, very scientific in this time period. Prior then, there was a lot of guesswork involved, and this sort of idea really permeated what we think of as scientific fields today. Prior to that time, weren't as scientific as we think of them today. So this movement towards bringing science in and making things scientific and professionalizing science, again, had a huge impact on the desire to prove that religion could be proven through science as well. So why did it become so popular? So again, science, obviously I just talked about that, but also you had the Second Great Awakening in the early 19th century. So this meant that the environment really became more open to religious interpretation, particularly in the United States. So you saw things like Mormonism emerge in the 1820s, Transcendentalism in the 1820s, and there was more of an emphasis on allowing ordinary people to make connections with God and interpret religious texts. Prior to that point, it was really, you had your minister or your priest interpreting religious texts to to the congregation or a wider audience. And in this period, there saw a greater allowance, a greater embrace of ordinary people making those connections themselves. And that's really key, because that is a big part of spiritualism, is interpreting different ideas or texts and bringing them into the home and discussing them in your home rather than in a church setting. You also saw in the mid-19th century sentimentalism in the form of writing, a lot of writing, poetry, those kinds of things. And this was really a tie to emotionality and appeal to feeling. And it was very, very popular with women. It was primarily women writers who were writing sentimentalist literature. And also women were very big into spiritualism. So the idea that you want to connect with lost loved ones really gained credence and popularity in the time period, along with, it kind of coincides with this idea of sentimentalism, this idea that you're allowed to still want to speak to people after they're gone. And then after World War I, there was a big surge in spiritualism and its popularity. So that obviously due to World War I, but also the 1918 flu pandemic. You saw great losses of life at the time. And again, people really wanting to connect with people who passed away. So on the Canadian census in 1901, that was the first time that spiritualism appeared on the census. And there were 616 declarants. In 1911, there were 677. And in 1921, there were 1,558. So that surge in 1921 is usually attributed to World War I and 1918 pandemic. In the United States, you saw also a surge in spiritualism after, excuse me, the Civil War. But keep in mind that it did remain sort of a fringe thing in Canada. So there is, historians agree that Canada tended to be more conservative in terms of religious expression as compared to the United States. So remember, I said the United States had saw the Second Great Awakening and saw more acceptance of different religious ideas. That was less embraced in Canada. So people weren't as open maybe about being spiritualist. So I would kind of call into question the accuracy of these census numbers, particularly 1901, 1911. It's hard to know how accurate that actually is, because to me, it would seem reasonable for people, number one, to maybe not want to declare themselves on an official document like the census. They may feel stigmatized to say something. They may also not identify themselves as a spiritualist. Maybe they go to, a few seances a year, but they're not as big into it as some other people. So they don't see themselves that way. I think there's probably a tendency at the time period to kind of see who is open to the ideas and then bring them into the fold. But I don't know how much people talked about it openly with strangers. So some of the techniques of seances, they're pretty interesting. So primarily it began with table rapping, so that we'd knocks on the table or on the floor or on the walls. And then it kind of progressed into moving tables and objects, automatic writing and psychography. So this is writing without consciously doing so. So we think of things like Ouija boards. The Ouija board, I believe, dates from around 1911 or 1915, around there. But before then, they used what they call talking boards, which today we would think of them as Ouija boards or close to a Ouija board. Psychography or automatic writing could also be passive holds on pencils. So you would hold a pencil in your hand and then it would move and write words without you consciously doing it or moving the pencil yourself. And then later in the turn of the 20th century and moving into the 1920s, you saw more kind of the ectoplasm appearing in medium, in seances, and that's when mediums would have things coming out of their nose and mouth, basically. I have a link to a pretty interesting series of photographs from the T.G. Hamilton collection at the University of Manitoba Archives. So if you're interested in that, I have my email at the end of the presentation. So if you do want to see that, just let me know and I can send you that. So here's a description of a seance from the famous American medium Mrs. Wright of Detroit, and this was in the Globe in 1898. I do think it's interesting to mention that when female mediums were mentioned in different writings, whether it was in a newspaper or by people who had attended these seances, they were typically referred to by Mrs. So-and-so, whereas men had their first and last name, pretty typical convention of the time period. But it does mean that sometimes it can be kind of hard to know and make connections between who these women actually were. So I do think that's interesting to note. So in this particular seance, they began with the Lord's Prayer and sang God Save the Queen. And this is under direction of Mrs. Wright's spirit guide, Dr. Sharp. And spirit guides were really popular amongst many mediums. Not all mediums had a spirit guide, but a lot of them did. Sometimes they would be indigenous people, and that's really interesting because these indigenous spirit guides wasn't uncommon for them to talk about the issues that were affecting indigenous people in the time period. So that's a really interesting note and something, if you're interested in, you can look up a little bit more, or if you want to know more about it, let me know. But in this case, Dr. Sharp is Mrs. Wright's spirit guide. So the spirit guides typically worked as a bridge between the living world and the dead. So you'd have your sitters, so those are the people that are sitting in the circle for the seance. You have the medium who's contacting the spirit world, and the medium may contact a spirit guide who contacts the wider spirit world, essentially, is how that typically worked or was conceived of. So in this case, Dr. Sharp through Mrs. Wright, so Mrs. Wright is actually doing the speaking, obviously. He begins speaking, he addresses the people by name and inquiring about different friends. And then he steps aside and allows other spirits to communicate with different members of the circle, sorry. So you see spirits of all ages and genders and every degree of kinship recognized by friends. And mainly these were conversations between the spirits and the people sitting in the circle about really mundane and trivial things. So things like, how's the new baby, and how is your sister, and did you ever end up moving, and things like that. So the kind of things that you would talk to with someone over the phone that you haven't seen in a long time, essentially. And so we tend to think of today, I think through pop culture, the idea of seance as being really spooky and all kinds of unexpected things happening. But in reality, they were very, I think maybe even kind of boring. If you were just sitting there waiting to talk to, you know, your father who had passed away, you'd have to wait to talk to this person through the medium and just have to listen to these kind of boring conversations about so-and-so's cousin or whatever. So it wasn't uncommon for people to just have very kind of trivial, boring conversations, but that was the reason they did this, because they wanted to connect with these people who passed away. So there's ideas about psychic development. So you can kind of, the idea was that you could kind of develop psychic abilities. In that case, that this kind of means like mediumistic abilities. Today we think of psychic being like mind reading, but in this time period, it was typically the ability to connect with the afterlife on some level rather than having to use a medium. So in this seance, they saw lights, others saw shadowy spirit forms, and this seance closed after 3 hours with a talk from Dr. Sharp. And I think it's interesting, and this was noted in the Globe article, but I do think it's important to point out that all sitters remained calm during the course of the seance. So again, we tend to think of it as kind of a spooky, scary thing, but really for the people sitting there, it was just a way to communicate with people who had passed away. So it wasn't uncommon, though, for people to test the medium. So this is particularly true if you were new to a seance. So if you'd never tried a seance before, you probably wanted to test to see whether it was real. But also amongst spiritualists, if it was a new medium, it wasn't uncommon for them to test the medium to see. And again, remember that this is supposed to be scientific. So this was a way to be scientific by asking questions that only the deceased person would know, asking for nicknames, greetings, dates of birthdays or deaths. And this was how they tried to maintain some kind of scientific method in doing these seances. So again, remember, it's a way to prove the existence of the afterlife or the spirit world. And so again, it wasn't uncommon to try and test the mediums. And then you also sometimes got information about the afterlife from the medium. So here's a seance, during a seance that occurred. This is during a Pincock seance. So I'm going to talk about her in a little while. But this supposedly comes from a spirit. So he says, each seance attracted a horde of spirits seeking to communicate with loved ones back on the earth plane. They say, if only we could have one word with our loved ones. When they see the bright light above the gate, they come by the thousands, ask for mother, father, son, or daughter. We put up a sign outside. It is the home of Mrs. Smith in Hamilton. They read and turn away with sadness and say, if only it were on my mother's door so I could go in and talk. And I think this is a kind of a revealing quote because it's makes you maybe want to, I don't know, maybe recruit more spiritualists, perhaps, by feeling bad for the spirits that have passed and not being able to contact other people. And if you think of this in terms of religion, a lot of the basis of many Christian denominations is bringing more people into the church. So this could potentially be along those lines or kind of influencing those things. I'm not certain, but I could see that maybe this is part of that. Okay, so spirit photography was also really popular. There's a really good book about it called The Apparitionists that I recommend. And this is a picture from 1920. And it's supposed to be showing a a table levitating, and with this ghostly hand here. The hand was actually, this is a doctored photo, obviously, and the hand was made by laying another photo on top during the development of the original photo. But spirit photography was very common as well as another form of this scientific proof. Okay, so some key figures. You can't talk about spiritualism really without talking about the Fox sisters, and they were born in Consacon. So all historians of spiritualism really agree that North American spiritualism, as we understand it, began with the Fox sisters. There's not a lot of debate about that. So it began with Kate and Margaret Fox. They were born in Consacon. They lived there until 1848. And their older sister Elizabeth remained in Prince Edward County, and they're known to have visited her in 1854 and 1855, potentially other times. So in 1848, they moved to Hydesville, New York. The ages that this incident occurred are debated, but sometime in their early teens. Maggie was 14, maybe, and Kate was 11, maybe. Again, it's debated. It's not really clear. So they're sitting out front. They stop their neighbor as she walks by, and they told her that they have these strange things happening at their house. They say that every time at bedtime, they hear raps on the walls and the furniture, and they actually are able to communicate with the raps. So that night, the neighbor comes by, and the parents were there as well. So I believe that this was also news to the parents, the Fox parents. So the parents and the neighbor and then the Fox girls were there. And so the girls ask the spirit to count to 5, it counts to 5. They ask it to count to 15, it counts to 15. They ask it to tell the neighbor's age, it's 33, it counts 33 knocks. They ask if the answer is yes, make 3 raps. Are you an injured spirit? It makes 3 raps. So they hear these things. The family promptly leaves the house, and the sisters move to Rochester with their sister Leah. But because Rochester was really into reform and religious activity at the time, this probably would have just kind of died off if they didn't move to Rochester, but they did. You had abolitionism, you had suffragists fighting for women's right to vote. So it was a very you had a lot of people in the temperance movement. So it was a very reform-minded area. And so it was a lot more open to new kind of ideas and concepts. If this had happened elsewhere, it would probably be deemed evil, or maybe they wouldn't want to talk about it, but because this was Rochester, people were more open to it. So there's a rumor that this story goes around Rochester. There's a rumor that the spirit was of a peddler that had been murdered in the farmhouse a few years before, and supposedly this is not confirmed this is not historically confirmed, yes or no. There's debates about this, but supposedly hair and possible bones were found in the basement by Rochester residents after the fact. Again, one doctor said that they weren't human bones, they weren't human remains, they were the remains of a dog or something. So it's debated about that incident. But anyway, this rumor goes around. So the Fox sisters are invited to the house of these community leaders, Isaac and Amy Post. And again, they go through this whole thing. They ask questions. There's response to the questions. And Leah Fox gets in on it, and she is able to communicate with the Post's recently deceased daughter. And this is really important because it shows that it doesn't matter where they are, they're able to communicate with the dead no matter where they are, and it doesn't matter who the person is. So it doesn't have to be like a restless spirit. It doesn't have to be in the place where the person died or anything like that. So this is really important because this makes up the basis of what spiritualism is thought to be. So after this happens, the Posts rent a hall to show everybody, and 400 people come, and it's a big deal, and they go through their whole thing with the table wraps and everything. And so news spreads of this happening as well. Here's a picture of the Fox home in Hydesville. It was actually moved at one point to Lilydale, New York. If you don't know anything about Lilydale, I suggest you look it up because it is a pretty interesting place. People still meet there today. It's sort of a mecca for spiritualists. So this farmhouse was moved there. Unfortunately, at one point it burnt down, so it's not there anymore, but that's what the little house was where this all began in Hydesville. So after the Rochester hall rental, the 3 sisters, Maggie, Kate, and Leah, begin a tour. So they begin at a suite at Barnum's Hotel, and this is P.T. Barnum's cousin. So P.T. Barnum, the great showman. So this is his cousin's hotel in New York. And they did demonstrations in the hotel's parlor so people can come and ask questions and do all these things. Leah stayed in New York, opening a seance room, but Kate and Maggie traveled all around the United States to different cities, showing what they could do. I thought it was interesting. Maggie actually married the explorer Elisha Kent Kane, and he was part of a member of different expeditions to rescue the Franklin expedition, and he was actually on the expedition that discovered their first winter camp. And he actually felt that she was a big fraud, and he denounced spiritualism, but he still fell in love with her and wanted to marry her. And then after he died, Maggie actually did come forward and say that it was a fraud. They made it up all along. This was in 1888. But then the next year in 1889, she recanted and said that the spirits told her to say that it was a fraud, but it wasn't really a fraud. So there was a lot of issues with that. The spiritualist community, a lot of them shunned the Fox sisters after this, and there was, they kind of died, sadly, very unhappily. So Leah died in 1890, Kate in 1892, and Maggie in 1893. And there was some alcohol abuse, unfortunately, in the later years of their life because they had such a tough time. So here's a picture of Kate and Maggie in 1852. Okay, so I mentioned the Fox sisters because they are from Consacon, and you really, again, can't talk about spiritualism without talking about them, even though they didn't really live in Belleville for very long, or the Belleville area, Hastings, for very long. So, but the Moodies did, and they were very, very, very big into spiritualism. So they created a spiritualist album, which you can, I think, access from Library and Archives Canada. And for them, spiritualism was really about proving religious conviction. So they proved how religious they were by being spiritualists because they were so dedicated to proving their faith. But it was also a social activity for them. And they did as many as 200 sessions between 1857 and 1863. So that's pretty impressive. And they took, like most people, comfort in the seances as a way to contact lost family members and friends. And eventually the family develops mediumistic abilities or psychic abilities. So Dunbar learns he's able to heal and supposedly heals different people. Susanna is a writing medium, so she connects with the spirit world through writing. Their daughter Agnes writes, and apparently Catherine Partrell was a very powerful writing medium. And she was able to receive messages in other languages, and she actually had instances, according to Susanna, instances of communicating with abusive spirits who called her names and things like that. So I guess it's important to note that not every seance went well or had friendly people. And it's also interesting that you could often connect with spirits that you didn't know. So it wasn't always even family members. It could be any kind of random person. So the Moodies did do seances with different people in Belleville, and I wanted to mention them because I think it's interesting for local history, but also if you're doing, you know, any kind of genealogy or anything like that, you might be interested in knowing this. So Mayor Benjamin Davy, who was the first mayor in 1850 and in 1854, supposedly his wife Cinderella was a tipping medium. So a tipping medium is somebody who communicates with a table moving. And they actually got the Moodies into spiritualism in 1854. And they lived on Campbell Street east of the Corby Library. So if you're curious where they lived and where that happened. And so the story of how they got the Moodies involved, supposedly, now remember Dunbar is the sheriff of Belleville at the time. And he and Mayor Davy are having a conversation about the strange Fox sisters and the strange table raps and all those things that happen. And Moody is very interested in this. And supposedly Mayor Davy says to him, you know, my wife is actually a medium. You should come over and check it out and see what she can do. And I also think that it's so fitting that her name is Cinderella. I think that's great. So that's how they got started with Mrs. Davy, Cinderella. And I guess they did a lot of seances with her throughout the years as well. So they typically, it seems like in Belleville, they typically had seances with her as their medium. So there's also J.W. Tate. So he was a civil engineer for the Grand Trunk, and he lived on Charlotte Street. He had a servant named Mary Williamson. So the story goes that she discovered her abilities by walking through the room, and a pale light came spreading from the corner of the room, and in the middle of the light stood a man, and it was John Reed, who had originally owned the house that they lived in. And then I guess when she moved around, furniture moved around the house, and taps followed her around when she walked around. There was also Delia O'Hare, who was Mayor John O'Hare's wife, and he was mayor from 1855 to 1856. And they did seances on John Street. There was also Frederick Rouse, who was a Quaker. And then Kate Fox had come to Belleville a couple times and done seances here with the Moodies. But the Moodies also did seances with her in New York. And obviously different members of the Moody family, they often did seances with them as well. So I do think, again, it's interesting. I also think it's really fascinating that these are pretty prominent people in town. So you have, you know, an engineer, you have the two different mayors, you have the sheriff, they're all involved in the spiritualism. This typically people who are spiritualists tended to also be reformers. So they believed in women's right to vote, they believed in abolition of slavery, and those kind of things typically went hand in hand. There is assertions by historians that Belleville was a very conservative town. I don't disbelieve that, but I do think that there is something really interesting about all these very prominent people in town being involved in this activity that would have been seen as very not mainstream. So I do think there's more there to kind of study and kind of explore a little bit more about what you can say about the elite, essentially, of Belleville engaging in these activities in a town that's pretty conservative. I think there's more to look at there. I think there's some interesting ideas there. Okay, so when Dunbar gets really into spiritualism, but Susanna really remains skeptical. So again, Dunbar was meeting with Mrs. Davies since 1854. In 1855, Moodies met with Kate Fox when she went to visit her sister. Dunbar's asked her to actually come to their house and demonstrate her ability, and she did. So how this went was Susanna wrote a list of friends who were living and dead, and the Knox would respond 3 for living, 5 for dead, and they all were correct. And then she has a communication with a deceased friend who, in their youth, they had promised to visit each other once one of them had died. So Susanna says, why didn't you ever try to contact me? And the spirit says she did try and she couldn't get through. And then they go out into the garden, and the knocks are heard in the garden as well. So it doesn't matter whether it's in the house. And I think this was kind of an attempt to show, a scientific attempt to show, like, oh, it's not coming from the floor, it's not coming from the walls, because we're standing out here in the garden, in the grass, and you can still hear the sound. And after Kate leaves, Susanna says she's very charming, but she's still, again, she's just really not convinced by her. And in fact, her and the maid are able to replicate the sounds by tapping their toes in a certain way. And then, so their neighbor, J.W. Tate, who was the engineer for the Grand Trunk, invites them over, saying their servant, Merrill Williamson, was a very, very powerful medium for physical manifestations, essentially moving tables and things like that. But again, Susanna is, like, she's a little bit more on board, but she's still skeptical. And so her and Dunbar have a big fight about it, and Dunbar is really offended, and he leaves the house, and Susanna goes upstairs and she sits at her dressing table, and she finally says, if there be any truth to this doctrine, let the so-called spirits move my hand against my will and off this table and lay it down in my lap. And I won't do her accent, but you can imagine that's what she says. And so when she's sitting there, after she says this, her hand is moved off the table and into her lap against her will, essentially. She doesn't move it herself. So she runs downstairs and she grabs Dunbar's spiritoscope, which is a talking board. So you can kind of think of it like a Ouija board. And she asks, was it a spirit who lifted my hand? And the spirit says, yes. She says, what spirit? And he says, a friend. And then finally she says, what is your name? And he says, Thomas Harrell. And he was the editor for the first literary magazine that Susanna wrote for. And she's finally converted after this whole thing. I thought this exchange was kind of funny because clearly you have to be very specific with spirits when you want to get your question answered. This is kind of a frustrating conversation. If you can imagine having a text message with someone who texts you and they won't tell you who they are, it's someone like that. So again, Dunbar was very, very involved in spiritualism, and he devised many tools for communicating with spirits. So without these tools, you would have to communicate by table knocks, which was very labor intensive. So if you wanted to, have a conversation, you'd have to go through the alphabet, and for each letter, there would be a knock to indicate that, okay, there's an A in this word, there's a B in this word, whatever. So he made these spiritoscopes. He made this thing, which if you can figure out what this is, you deserve a prize, because I don't know. No one knows what this is, but this description of a machine of some kind with a pulley. And then he also devised for automatic writing a planchette. So basically that little planchette that you would see with a Ouija board, but replacing one of the legs with a pencil so that it can go across the page and write. Here's an image of a spiritoscope. This one was designed by Robert Hare, but Moodies' design was probably based off of this. So this is what it looks like. I'm not entirely sure exactly how it works. There's a blog online if you're interested in seeing different kind of pictures of different kinds of talking boards. It's called Mysterious Planchette. So if you Google that, it should come up. And that's where I found this image. So Dunbar traveled pretty often to visit mediums. He went to Toronto, to New York. In 1844, they had lost a 5-year-old son tragically while the boy was fishing on the bay. And the Belleville seances were unable to contact him. But in a Toronto seance with a Mrs. Swain, again, no first name given, in 1856, they were able to contact him. And then afterwards, they're able to keep continuing with through Mrs. Davy with Johnny. And another kind of interesting story that I came across was that apparently Dunbar taught a spirit to read. So I guess he communicated with a spirit who said that he couldn't answer with the writing because he couldn't write. So he couldn't use the automatic writing or the spiritoscopes to answer the questions. So apparently he instructed this spirit in literacy, I guess. It's kind of an interesting little story. And then the Moodies continued to practice spiritualism as a family for many years. So here's an image of Susanna and Dunbar and the Strickland brothers in 1857. Okay, so another couple of interesting spiritualists and an interesting story for sure is the story of Mary Merrill and her sister Flora MacDonald Denison. And Flora is a very, very interesting person. I really enjoyed reading about her. So I'll talk about her first, and then I'll kind of talk about Mary and her unfortunate situation. So Flora was born in 1867 in Bridgewater, which is now Actonolite, I guess. I don't really know how to pronounce that properly, so forgive me. Her father was George Merrill, who was the brother to Judge Edwards Merrill of the Merrill House. They moved to Belleville, and Flora went to school here. Then she went to the Collegiate Institute in Picton, where she lived with an aunt and uncle, possibly at the Merrill House. I am not sure. That you could check that through the census. I didn't do that, but you could probably find out. So then afterwards, she was a school teacher in the area. She really did not like that. She did not enjoy being a school teacher. She was very unhappy. Then she moved to Toronto, then to Detroit, where she became a journalist, and she married Howard Denison, and they had a son, Merrill, so that name is very popular, stayed in the family. She, again, super interesting person. So she was involved in the women's suffrage movement. So she was actually a Canadian delegate in Copenhagen for the Third World Conference of International Suffrage Alliance. So she actually traveled to Copenhagen as a Canadian delegate for this conference that happened. And she was very big in the suffrage movement, and eventually actually the other suffragists thought that she was too extreme. Her ideas were way too radical for the rest of them, so they kind of excluded her and didn't want her involved in their movement anymore because she was too much. So then eventually she bought the Bon Echo Inn on Mazenal Lake in 1910 and lived there. And actually she rented it out as well to, or her son Merrill took it over, and they rented it out to members of the Group of Seven. So it was an interesting place. So her first spirit encounter, Flora's first spirit encounter was with her sister, and that happened in the mid-1880s when she was working in Belleville area. It's not clear whether she's actually working in Belleville, but she's working in the area as a school teacher. Again, she wasn't very happy. So essentially, she's lying in bed, she's not feeling well. Her sister comes, steps down from the wall and walks to the foot of her bed and stands beside her. And then she gets these images in her head of, sent from her sister, I guess, of like being happy and successful. And then Mary smiled and faded where she stood. And then Flora feels very calm and peaceful after this. And then the next day she goes out and she sits by a creek and she gets more visions from her sister. And so her sister is a really fascinating person as well and had a very unfortunate death. So she was born in Picton in 1858, and she was a top student. She took the highest honors in math at Alexandra College, which was it was the ladies' college of Albert College. And she was very well known for being a very, very smart woman. And according to Flora, she also had telekinetic powers to move tables and chairs and psychic abilities to communicate with the dead, supposedly. So in 1880, she, possibly April 7th, so you can leave a comment in the comment section if you know the answer to this, but apparently, there's no official record of her death and no gravesite has ever been found for her. So I don't know if that has since changed since the book that I read on it. I tried to find this information. I couldn't find anything about her. So if you do know, leave a comment. But I guess the best date we have is April 7th, and that's from the Belleville Intel. So at 9:30 a.m., she was found in her bed with no pulse, and she was declared dead by a Dr. Wilson. At 4 p.m., there was an inquest, and it was agreed that she died in convulsion caused by a previous state of debility. In the meantime, she's lying in a cold room with just a sheet over top of her. At 8:30 p.m., she's examined by a Dr. Thomas E. Allen, who was a homeopathic doctor. This may sound a little bit strange, but in the time period, it wasn't uncommon for people to use homeopathic doctors fairly regularly. There was a great mistrust in the medical establishment, mainly because it was difficult for doctors to cure people. So the 1880s really was the beginning of scientific medicine as we understand it today. So you have germ theory emerging. You have so the work by Louis Pasteur and Lister, all these people are really emerging in this time period. But a lot of people really clung to the fact that previous to this time, a lot of the treatments that doctors gave, like mercury, seemed to do more harm than good. And a lot of times did, because they just didn't have the knowledge to treat things. They didn't have the scientific skill or knowledge to treat things the way we do now. So it wasn't, again, unusual for people to use homeopathic doctors. So I guess the Merrill family did this branch of the Merrill family used Dr. Allen. So he discovers that at 8:30 p.m. that her body is still warm. So he applies treatment, and in this case, it's warm water, water bottles, and warm irons. So he's trying to warm up her body. At 11 p.m., he finds that she has a faint pulse. And overnight, they keep treating her. Her body temp is rising, and they believe her to be in some kind of coma. At 7 a.m., her temperature has risen to 67 degrees, according to Dr. Allen. That day, between 1 and 2 p.m., she's examined by Drs. Ridley and Tracy. They're supposedly experts, but it's never really said experts of what. I don't know. They say, again, that she is still alive, she's in a coma, and her temperature is 70 degrees. And so Dr. Allen wishes to apply a test of electricity, so he runs to fetch a battery. Now, I don't really know what this is. I assume that it is to see if there's some kind of electric response from from her body, but again, I really don't know. I'm not sure exactly what that is. And then at 7 p.m., he comes back and he finds that she's cold in the face and that her body has begun rapid decomposition and she's finally declared dead. So this whole thing happens. It's a really unfortunate situation for this poor woman and her poor family. According to the historian, McMullen, he says that in the writings, in spiritualist writings of this time period, or he says esoteric writings, he says that there's a similarity in this whole situation to what is written about failing to return to a body after a period of astral projection or soul travel. So I guess the implication here being, and this man is a historian, so I don't know, but the implication being, I guess, that Mary was undergoing astral projection or soul travel and failed to return to her body. I don't know. So while Mary was alive, according to Flora, she had psychic abilities and probably practiced spiritualism herself. So the evidence that we have for that is that we know that W. Haig Evans wrote in the Toronto Daily Star in 1901 that he attended a seance in 1875 with Mary, in which she practiced levitation of objects. On 19th of April, 1880, there is a sermon, which is summarized in the Daily Intel. It's a sermon by Reverend Mr. Schuster at the Bible Christian Church. And he essentially says that, he says, spiritualism had not given her any comfort, but true religion would have achieved that end. And it's a warning against the practice of spiritualism. So apparently she was involved in this. It was known that she was involved in this. So I guess she was also a spiritualist. So Flora, after her experiences with her sister coming to visit her, she embraced spiritualism in a big way. So she really believed that Mary was still living and could make herself known. And she eventually writes the book Mary Melville, the Psychic, in 1900, which was published by this man that I'll talk about in a minute, B.F. Austin, where she met him at Lilydale Spiritualist Summer Camp in Lilydale, New York, which again is a really fascinating place. I encourage you to look it up. It was a place for spiritualists to go in the summertime and have all kinds of seances, and they still do it today. Probably not this summer because of the pandemic, but I don't know. So it's an interesting place. So she met Austin there, and B.F. Austin is a big name. I'll talk about him in a second. And I believe that she was also the librarian for the summer at the Spiritualist Library at Lilydale. So she really got into spiritualism after this meeting with her sister. Okay, so who is this man, B.F. Austin? So he was born in Brighton in 1850. He attended in school in Brighton, and then he became a teacher there at 16. He went to Albert College, which he attended with Merrill, which is important because that would be when he met Flora. That would probably be why he agreed to publish her book. But again, he was very, very, very big into publishing, so I'm not sure that it would have mattered. I think he probably would have published it anyway. He graduated with a Bachelor of Arts, first class honors in 1877. Then he got his divinity degree from Victoria College in Coburg in 1881 and became a Methodist minister. His 2-year-old daughter tragically died in the 1890s. So in 1897 to 1898, he writes this book with the world's longest title, which you can actually access on the Internet Archive if you want to. And he moved to Rochester in 1904. Again, Rochester. So Rochester is very liberal with ideas of spiritualism. So he published widely about seances. So if you're interested, you can read about, these are some different seances that he attended and wrote about. Here's another one in 1901. So you'll see Hugh R. Moore. So in Philadelphia, it's with Mrs. Wilcox from California. In Philadelphia, it's with Hugh R. Moore. So this psychography medium you get his first name. And so he's very, very dedicated to spiritualism. He gives a sermon about the scientific proof of life after death, for which he was unfortunately found guilty of heresy by the London Conference, and he was excommunicated from the Methodist Church. So he goes along and he says, oh, I'm just going to make my own church. So he makes the Spiritualist church called the Plymouth Church, where he was a preacher from 1906 to 1911 in Rochester. In 1911, he moved all the way to Los Angeles and spoke often at the Church of Revelation, where he was ordained to spiritualist ministry by National Spiritualist Association in 1914. And I included him, even though he didn't live in the area for very long, I did include him because he is a very important figure in spreading spiritualism throughout the US and particularly in Canada. Even though he didn't live here, he still published widely. And he actually published Reason magazine in Toronto for many, many years. Even after moving to the United States, he had this magazine distributed in Toronto. And he had another magazine which he distributed. And he also published many books by different spiritualists, including Flora, Denison. So he was a key figure in spreading these ideas in Canada, and that is why I included him, even though he didn't live in this area for very long. Okay, so Jenny O'Hara Pincock. So she's another pretty important figure. She was born in Madoc in 1892. Her great-grandfather was an early settler in North Hastings, and he was known as the Squire around town. She moved to Whitby in 1908 to study music. She then went on to the Royal Conservatory. A friend of her husband's, who was an engineer with a degree from U of T, introduced them to spiritualism. And she had her first seance with William Carthauser in 1927. She had many, many seances with this man throughout her time practicing spiritualism. She published the book Trials of Truth in 1930, documenting seances between 1928 and 1929, which was very favorably reviewed by spiritualist press in US and England. So again, she was very key in spreading ideas of spiritualism. Here's a picture of the seance, one of the seances. There's this little girl who was Colleen Gildner lying against a slab. And Jenny Pincock is the blurry one on the right. So she actually started a spiritualist church, the Church of Divine Revelation in St. Catharines, and also a healing group as part of that, the Radiant Healing Circle. She also visited Lilydale throughout her life and was also the librarian there for a summer. She was good friends with B.F. Austin and attended seances. They attended seances in Lilydale together, so they knew each other quite well. And she actually published her reports on the seances in his Reason magazine. After her husband died, she was able to contact him and they sang together. And then eventually she retired to O'Hara's Mill near Madoc and spent time at the Moira River Conservation Authority, where apparently there's a museum. I haven't been there, so it's on my list. And again, like B.F. Austin, she was really important in spreading and particularly institutionalizing spiritualism in Ontario. So she created a church which institutionalized it, made it a little bit more legitimate. So here's her instructions for a seance. It should consist of 3 or more people, should be evenly divided, male and female, should take place in complete darkness. Once or twice a week is often enough, but never less than once. So you actually, I guess, have to do it quite often. So if you're in ill health or have bad thinking or doubt and criticism, you're going to cause adverse vibrations, which are going to ruin the sitting. They should start with the Lord's Prayer so that you don't have any bad spirits or bad vibrations. And in her seances, 3 taps equal yes, 2 is doubtful, and 1 is no, or no tap at all. And that you should be sitting in a proper order. And you should have flowers in the room as well. So here is an advertisement for services at the Church of Divine Revelation, so Jenny's church, and it's in the Oddfellows Hall Temple, which is very fitting. And so there's 3 different addresses. One of them is with William Carthauser, who is apparently a reverend, and I don't know whether he's a reverend in the Spiritualist church or a reverend, whether he has any kind of degree in divinity for a different Protestant group. I'm not sure. I didn't research him that well because he's not from here, but he's a world famous psychic of New York. So Jenny, again, and it's interesting too that she started a church as a woman in a time period in which these kind of things like having power, religious power, didn't really exist for women to the same extent as today. So she is again a really interesting character and important for, again, institutionalizing spiritualism in Canada. I wanted to include this story because I don't want to give the impression that everybody was really open to spiritualism. So again, if you remember from the beginning, I said that Belleville was known to be quite conservative, and I've seen historians use this as an example of the conservatism in Belleville. So this Henry Slade, who was a very famous medium from New York, he filled exhibition halls in the United States and Europe, and he practiced slate writing. So he had messages from the dead would appear on a slate, essentially, as if by magic. In 1882, he gave a demonstration in Belleville, which in itself is, well, I think that's very fascinating that he came here. But the chief of police at the time, UManitoba, wanted to show that he was a fraud. So he befriended Slade and asked for a private seance after the show, and four went to watch him closely. They had a second seance the second night, and they interrupted him, and they told him they'd figured out his trick. And essentially Slade would have already written on the slate and would distract the sitters while he switched them out the blank for the written one. And he immediately confessed, but he convinced the police not to charge him with fraud, and he left and went back to the United States. And then McKinnon writes letters to the Oswego Free Press to expose Slade. So again, this is supposedly evidence of conservatism in Belleville, but I think there's more to it than that, because the fact that he came to Belleville in the first place to me is really interesting. So I don't know, again, something to kind of maybe look at more if you're interested in the topic. It could be something you can look at a little bit more and explore, but I do think it's telling that he came here in the first place, but also that the chief of police wanted to show that he was a fraud. So I don't know what that says to you, but I think that there's more to it than just plain conservatism in Belleville. So some conclusions. So spiritualism was really a balance between science and religion. It was the practice of religion using the scientific method, and allowed people to communicate with loved ones. So for a town so small, a population of 6,000 in 1865, it is pretty surprising how many people embraced it, given that, again, the conservatism of Canada at the time. You have mayors, engineers, and the sheriff. And like I just said, the conservative in Belleville is evidenced by the Slade situation, as well as religion. So if you remember when Merrill passed away, there was also the sermon given against spiritualism. But there is no doubt that Hastings, Prince Edward counties really played an important role in the spread of spiritualism throughout the US and Canada. There are some really key figures here that came from the area, not just the Fox sisters, but also B.F. Austin, Jenny Pincock, particularly for spreading it throughout Canada. Were pretty important characters. So some recommended resources. I really recommend Stanley McMullen's book, Anatomy of a Seance. This is really the canon on the topic. There's some interesting bits and pieces in Jerry Boyce's Belleville Popular History. This book by John Robert Colombo is kind of a funny book. There's all kinds of weird, if you're into like peculiar events, this is a book that you'll really enjoy, Mysterious Canada. You can always check out the library's Belleville History Alive, and that is available. If you just Google Belleville History Alive, it'll come up. This is the library's digitized newspaper archive. So all kinds of newspaper clips and things like that. So there's some interesting things in there. If you want to know more about the Moodies and their spiritualism work, there's the Susanna Moody Letters of a Lifetime book and Letters of Love and Duty, and these are both collected by Carl Ballstad. And then there's also the T.G. Hamilton collection at University of Manitoba. There's some digitized images there. And then there's this very creepy T.G. Hamilton Ectoplasm YouTube video that I highly recommend. Just don't read it at nighttime, or sorry, excuse me, watch it at nighttime, because it's pretty creepy and there's some creepy music, but it's definitely worth watching. And if you want to know more or have any questions for me, please just send me an email, vsitsma@bellevillelibrary.ca. Okay, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.